So I'd like you to start out by going out to here. It's w3schools.com/css/css3. If you just go to the CSS and you start scrolling down in here, you'll find it. Or you can type in the entire URL that I put in there. And again, you don't need this. You can just put in, should be able to just put in that. If it comes up and it looks like what I've got here with CSS Flexbox, you're good. Yes, I did. But not everybody looks at their emails. So that's why I decided to do it like this too. So. Now, for years, when you wanted to position things on the page, so if you wanted to take and stick something on a web page and have stuff flow around it to the left or to the right, you've all seen this where you've got a picture and the text kind of flows around it one way or the other, etc. Really, the only way that you could do that was with floats. And by and large, developers hate floats. You forget to turn them off, they get hinky. Even sometimes when you set them up correctly, they can look funky on certain browsers, etc. So they're a pain in the butt. So they came up with this thing, and actually there's two of them. This is Chapter 9. Chapter 9 talks about Flexbox, so that's what we're going to talk about today. Chapter 10 talks about yet another way of doing this, and it's called CSS Grid. There are differences between them. We'll talk about those in just a bit. But one of the biggest differences between them is the fact that when you set up Flexbox like this, it's two-dimensional. It's kind of the world that we live in. When you set up Grid, that we'll get into, I don't know when, but some other day, that's three-dimensional. So you can do things with it that are harder, if not impossible, to do with Flexbox. All right? Flexbox isn't hard to use. The only problem is it's got a lot of commands. And I would strongly suggest if you bookmark things on your browser, you bookmark this page. Because when you take the test next week, you're asked to do everything inside of Flexbox. Okay, do you see why I decided to postpone the test? Because everything has to be in Flexbox. Well, if we haven't talked about Flexbox yet, I thought that would be not a very nice thing to do. And honestly, it's on me because I was looking at it yesterday, and I made a small change to the file, and I went to change it, and it said on there for the name 7 through 9, and I thought, well, wait a minute, this is 7 through 8. So I looked at the top, and it said 7 through 9, and then I thought, well, geez, maybe I just didn't read, and I didn't read it. There was a misspelling near the bottom of the page, and I fixed the misspelling. I went up and looked and said, make sure you put everything in a Flexbox. Okay. So that's, again. All right, so let's take a look. Now, when you use Flexbox, and we're just going to run through this. We're not going to run through every single thing that's in here. All right, but I want to show you some of the things. When you set up a Flexbox, there's two things that you can do. You can put everything in a container. Remember we talked about divs? And that's what a div is. It's a container. It stands for division, but it's a container. And you can put stuff into a div, and that's kind of what they've done here. Okay? And even if the things are of different sizes, if you take the container and you basically set it up for display flex, now you're using Flexbox. That's all you have to do to get started. And even if they're different sizes, typically once you do that and say display flex, now they're all the same size. And they're like this. All right, you might say that's a good thing or that's a bad thing. I don't know. But as it says there, before Flex, this is what you did. And to be honest with you, probably the worst out of these three, believe it or not, is using tables. And that, unfortunately, even though that was the worst way of doing things, that's the way that a lot of people did things. So you might say, well, if that's the worst way, why did they do it? Because what happens is a lot of developers, and you'll find this out yourselves over time, they would go and they would create very ornate type of templates that they could modify to do almost anything they wanted to do. I know people who are web developers They have this big, humongous table that they use for every website they create. And that table has in it maybe hundreds of other tables. It's not the right way to do things. Okay? So, as it says, Flexbox is basically now supported by all modern browsers. Again, you're going to have problems with earlier versions of Internet Explorer. All right? And what you have to basically do is you have to say, you know what? Pardon my French, but screw it. If you got an earlier version, then you're SOL, as they say. Or SOOL, whatever the heck it is. So it says, to start a Flexbox model, you need to define a container. Well, there's a container. So what we have here is a container called Flex Container. Just so you know, where we have class equal Flex, there's nothing magical about the name Flex Container. You can call it Angie, and it will work just fine. But, you know, since it is going to be a container that's going to hold Flexbox components, most people call it something like that. All right? So there's 3 divs inside. So when you look right here, there's nothing magical about it until we come in here and put in this magical line right there, display flex. If we get rid of that line and we run, see the difference? All right? Even if these were different sizes, so we come back in here and we just say display flex. We run it, and it's starting to bring some stuff to it. Now, you might look at that and go, well, it's way pushed over to the left. There's a lot of white space, or blue space in this case, and I get that. You can work on that stuff too, and that's what we're going to be going through in here. All right, but what I want you to understand is the container that holds your Flexbox items. You want to make sure that has a display flex around it. All right? Okay, that's the parent container. Now, look at this. These are properties that work with the container, not with the things in the container, with the container itself. Okay? So notice the direction. What you can basically do is you can set it up the way we just saw it, where it was 1, 2, 3. You can, instead of having it go to the start, you can have it go to the end. You can have it be centered. So there's a lot of things you can do with the directions. Wrap. You're going to see an example of that in just a minute. And when you wrap, it's as your browser becomes smaller and you've got less room, what do you want to have happen? You know, typically you want things to shrink, and if there are 3 or 4 columns, eventually you want them 1 column on a phone type of an idea. All right. The flow, left to right, right to left. Justify content, you're going to see this. Examples of all these. Aligning items, left, right, center. Aligning content. Now, when you align items, you align everything that's inside of your Flexbox. So if I've got 10 items, okay, I'm aligning everything. There's also something called align self. So if I want one to just look goofier than the other ones, I can do that. That's all in here. All right? And I mean, all I can tell you is, and you'll get some time today, take a look at this. It's not going to make sense until you read the chapter in the book, which we will go over in just a couple minutes. Gabriel, you know, just so you know, I told everybody, I didn't realize it, but the test is actually on 7, 8, and 9. So since we didn't go over 9 yet, we're going to do that right now. Okay? So that's the direction as it says. So notice this. All right? So what does that mean? Well, look at this. So notice it says here flex direction column. It's pretty obvious when you look at that exactly what it looks like. That's not the default. Row is the default, where they're all laid out on the same row. In fact, if I leave this, leave this out, see how it still looks the same? That's the default value. Okay? So there's nothing wrong with putting it in. Okay, so we can put in flex direction, but it's typically, if you're going to use it, you use it with column. So you want things in a columnar format. Again, the idea is, think about this. This is how you can lay stuff out on a page. All right? Okay, so there's the row and the column. Again, I don't want to keep running through every one of these. There's a row reverse. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, it goes 3, 2, 1. And you might think, well, why would I want that? There's actually very good reasons you might want it. There's a good thing about doing that, and there's a bad thing about doing that. Let's suppose for a minute, and I'm going to erase this right away, but let's suppose that I've got some kind of a setup that looks like this. I may have even shown you something like this the other day. I don't remember. But here's a header. Here's a footer. Here's an aside. We'll call it aside left. Here's an aside right. And here's our main content. As you shrink that down, you may want the main content to be on top, and then the align left and the align right, etc. So you can change the order of these things, so as the size changes, you can change the order of them. All right? Now that's the good news. The bad news, you can change the order of them, and that helps for probably the 90+% of the world that isn't blind. But if you are sight impaired, it's a problem, because if you're using a screen reader, it still puts them in the order that you put them in. It goes from 1, 2, 3, etc. All right, so that can be a little bit problematic. The wrap I already mentioned, but let's just quickly take a look at it. So notice we've got here flex wrap wrap. Notice what happens when I make this smaller. Notice how eventually it goes down to just one column. Multiple rows, but just one column. And as I stretch it out, and I'm not doing anything special to do this, other than putting in their flex wrap wrap. Now, if we put in there, I don't remember if it's, I think it's no dash, but I could be wrong here. I think it's no dash wrap, okay? Now, notice that doesn't look very good, all right? But there may be a reason you don't want to allow certain things to wrap. Something has to be kept together. Now, if that was the case, probably what I'd do, I'd come in and shrink the size of these things as it got smaller or whatever, or bigger. I guess it's no wrap with no dash in it. Maybe mine didn't even work correctly. You can wrap things again in reverse. All right. So notice there's a flex row wrap. I want to get into these. Justify content. All right. It should be obvious taking a look at that that's centered. Okay, that makes sense. Now, so justify content center. No big thing. All right. You can do flex start. That's the default. Remember how they looked and there was 1, 2, 3 and they were just way pushed to the left? Instead of flex start, you can do flex end when they're pushed all the way over to the right. So you can do a flex start for basically for left justification. You can say center, or you can say flex end for basically right justification. All right? Like I said, I don't want to run through every one of these with you, but there's a couple that I think are important. Now notice this one says space around. Okay? Well, when you look at this, I think the other one is. Okay? Now you may or may not be able to tell the difference between those. What space between did was it left an equal amount of space between each one of these. But it pretty much pushed the ones on the end up to the end. On the other hand, space around does a little bit better job of justifying. It's not perfect. This is smaller than this, but it's better as far as laying it out typically to most people. All right? You say, well, I don't agree with that. Then you can do it the other way. All right? Some of the requirements that are given on your next test, and again, if you came in late, you didn't hear this, I didn't realize the test is on 7, 8, and 9. Since we haven't covered 9 yet, we're not going to have the test till next week. All right? So, again, I mentioned aligning items. Like I said, I don't want to go through every example that's in here. There's a baseline thing. So notice how they've set that up. So if you do have things that are of different sizes, they pretty much all line up in the center if you want to do that. You don't have to do that. All right. You mentioned the space between and the space around. The default when you're working with this stuff is stretch, which says basically take up all the room you can. Okay, so you don't have, when you've got an align content stretch, since it's the default, you don't really have to put it in. All right. It says, in the following example, we solve a very common style problem, perfect centering. It says, set both justify content and align items to center, and something will become perfectly centered. So if you do want to make sure, and a lot of times you'll do that, you might have a graphic that's fairly big, but it's on your home page, and you want to make sure that's right in the middle. All right, this is one way that you can do it. All right, so that's everything for the container. Then it jumps down into the items. All right, so that's the stuff that's inside of the container. So again, this looks just like what we saw before, but now look what's different. Some of these we've already talked about, like order. Do you want it to go 1, 2, 3, or do you want it to go 3, 2, 1 type of an idea? All right. Some of these they're a little weird until you start working with them. Flex grow. All right, you're going to see this in just a minute, but the idea is if maybe I've got 4 things and I don't want them to grow at the same rate. So I can give one a flex grow with a number in it, and it'll grow faster than the other ones will. So if I put a 2 in there, it'll grow twice as fast typically as the other ones will. All right. So again, the order I already mentioned. Okay. And you can change the order if you want to. Notice what they've done here. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, it's going to come out 4, 2, 1, 3. There may be a reason that you want to do that. The grow I mentioned. Notice it specifies how much a flex item will grow relative to the rest of the flex items. Now, if you do this, because I want to go through this example and the next one, notice what they have in here. So they have flex grow 8 for this one. Okay, these have both got a 1 and these have got an 8. This doesn't mean this is necessarily going to always be 8 times what these two are. What it means is whatever space you have left after you've aligned these, all right, give 8 of them as opposed to every 1 that you give to the other 2. It's not exactly the same thing. And again, you'll notice that's not 8 times this, but it's working with the area that you have available to you. Sometimes the only way to do this stuff is to play with it. All right? And it may not make a whole heck of a lot of sense until you do. All right? And shrink is just the opposite of that. Maybe as you're going through this, you want to take something that's in there and you want it to shrink or not shrink. This one's kind of neat. Flex basis. They don't have a width. There's no flex width. Basis basically is used as the width. So notice it says it specifies the initial length of a flex item. It's really not the length, it's the width. All right, so if we look at this example, flex basis 200 pixels. Set the initial length just of this one to 200 pixels. And when you start working with this, you can work with percentages as well. Remember we talked about 200 pixels, that's an exact size. But you can work with percentages if you'd rather do that. Or M's or Rems, etc. Some of the other stuff that we have talked about. All right. Then there's a property that's just called flex. It's a shortcut. So, after the word flex, you can put 3 different values. The first value, all right, stands for that flex grow that we looked at. The second one is for the flex shrink that we talked about. The third one is what you want it to start with. So if you don't want anything special with the grow or shrink, but you want it to start with 200 pixels, you can do this. All right. Good, bad, or indifferent, there's shortcuts for almost everything that you do in here. So that's why I said when you take your test next week, it literally says on the test page near the top, everything that you do in here must be put inside of a Flexbox container. All right. It's also totally legit. You can have a Flexbox container inside of a Flexbox container. That's starting to get a little complex. Do you want to do that? It depends. Maybe not as your first jump into Flexbox, but you may eventually if you're a web designer. All right. So as it says, the align self specifies the alignment for a selected item. So you'll notice by saying display flex, these would all be the same size. But we've aligned self for the third one a little bit differently. All right. And they've got, you can see this responsive image gallery using Flexbox. Okay. So the idea is, this is the way they looked originally. They're different sizes, etc. So you can run that on there and you can have it look much more professional. I didn't even go down and look at this one. Okay. Now, I'm going to give you another URL that I want you to look at, please, if I can find the right one. All right, that's this one. It's a little long. Sorry about that. I'm going to have to cut the size down here. Okay, again, you shouldn't need the HTTPS, but put the rest of that in there if you would, please. And as Gabriel mentioned, Gabriel B, that this is, I sent you the URL for this too, so you already have that in the second email I sent you this morning. And literally, how did I find this? I typed in CSS Flexbox tutorial. Actually, I typed in interactive tutorial. And what I liked about this one, take a look. This is everything over here. See this flex direction? All right, you can see exactly what it looks like. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice if I click on row reverse. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you can click on something and it interactively shows you exactly what happens with it. So if I want to see what happens with flex end, that one didn't change, but that's a stretch. If I want to flex end here, now you can see how it's setting it up at the bottom. Flex start is at the top. Flex center is in the, you get the idea. All right, this is another one. As you're going through this stuff, you might want to take a look at it. All right. Okay, one more thing, and then we're going to go into the chapter. And again, I sent you this article this morning. I thought this was good. I went and read a whole bunch of articles. I think our book is good, but I don't think our book is great. I'm still looking for a great article on this stuff. And I mean something that you can read it and it's like, oh, that totally makes sense. I don't think it exists. All right. Now this, like I said, I sent this to you. It's from freecodecamp.com. It's called Flexbox, the Ultimate CSS Flex Cheat Sheet. Okay. And it goes through these animated GIFs from Scott Domes, and I also sent you the link to that just so you know you have it. That's this. How Flexbox works, explained with big, colorful, animated GIFs. I'm not going to go over any of this. The only thing I do want to show you is down at the bottom. I'm going to jump way down to the bottom here. What you are asked to do as part of your homework, it's either homework or a lab for this one, is to go through this Flexbox Froggy. And I've had people do it before, and basically they say it's a little hokey, but they've learned quite a bit. I've had other people say, you know what, I went through most of it, but man, it just was not good. So this thing talks about another one. It's called Flexbox Defense. So if you like to get online and play games, that's what this is. It's an interactive game that basically teaches you. All right, I have not gone through it, but that's what it is. Okay? All right, so with all that said, I'm going to jump in to Chapter 9. This is Section 2 of the book. It's Chapters 9 and 10. As it says in Chapter 9, you learn how to use flexible box layout. It's typically called Flexbox. In Chapter 10, you learn what's called CSS Grid Layout. All right? They can be used, you already know this. You can create a web page that doesn't have either one. You can create a web page that has either one, or you can actually combine both on the same web page. All right? So if you've got a more complex page, you may decide that you want to use both. All right? But there's certain articles and books and stuff out there that say, well, you got to use this one or you got to use this one. No. You can use them together, and it's not really a problem to use them together. So our book here, Chapter 9, How to Use Flexible Box Layout for a Page. So when you look at this, notice getting started, a lot of this we already talked about. We'll talk about the main axis and the cross axis under how to set the properties. I would suggest that if we get done with this and you're like, I'm just totally confused, I have no idea what any of this stuff is, I would at least start by looking at, on the last 8 or 9 pages of the chapter, a responsive web page that uses Flexbox. Again, we are shooting for responsive here. So we are shooting for to have it, whether I'm looking at it on my phone, on a tablet, on a laptop, on a desktop, on something else, projector unit. It doesn't matter. I want it to look nice always, and whether it's portrait or landscape, I want it to look nice. All right? So, like I said, I don't want to sit and read to you. In the last chapter, we talked about using media queries. Not a lot, but a little bit. You saw some examples. I showed you some. Some people don't like using them either, and they don't think that they work all that great. So Flexbox is another alternative. All right? They say that it provides a more efficient way to lay out, align, and distribute space among elements. That's what it is. So again, you create a container that you want to basically constrain everything inside of. You set things up, you do a display flex on that container and any container property of the ones we looked at. Then you can also change one or more or all or none items that are inside of that container. Now, when you're working on this, and I'm not going to read this because it's kind of confusing. By default, notice that we've got a main axis and a cross axis. All right, and you're used to this. You know, we typically call them X and Y. All right, and it depends on whether or not you are putting things out in a row, basically in a row format or in a columnar format. If you change from one to the other, the cross axis can become the main axis, and the main axis can become the cross axis. Did you all hear what I just said? It depends on whether you're doing things in a row format or in a column format. So if I've got 6 things, do I want one in each row? Or if I've got room, do I want just one row with 6 columns in it? All right, that kind of an idea. So as it says here, here is a navigation menu created using Flexbox. And the idea is, now they don't all look the same size, but we could make them the same size. All right? This is just one way of setting this stuff up. I'm not saying it's the only way. And as we go on, you may think, yeah, it's not only is it not the only way, it's not the best way. All right? So, as it says, it's how you use it to develop page layouts that conform to different screen sizes. Flexbox is a container, and it contains flex items. All right? As it says, they're laid out along the main axis. And they're aligned typically along the main axis or along the cross axis. Okay, width and height are still used as it says. If width is not explicitly set, it defaults to 100%. And again, it's supported by all major browsers. So when you look in here, again, I don't want to sit and read to you, but I already went over these with you. We talked about the direction and the like. So what do they have in here? This is the key thing. Display flex. And they're setting it up in a columnar format. Okay? And when you look at that, by default, you might look at that and go, wait a minute, you said it was in a columnar format. Well, remember one thing. By default, these items that you put in here, an unordered list, the items that you put into an unordered list, by default, they're what are called block level items. They each go on their own line. You can change that, all right? But by default, they each go on their own line. So as it says, every HTML element has a default value, whether it's a block element or an inline. The difference, again, between a block element and an inline element. A block element is something like a paragraph. When you've got a paragraph, there'll be a blank line before it and a blank line after it. That's the way paragraphs are set up. All right. On the other hand, when you use an inline element, that's like using a strong tag or an M tag or something. That's changing something inside of typically what's a block element. So there is no blank space before it or after it. How to set the properties? Again, that's why I went over what I went over. I didn't think this was great in that this doesn't show examples, but the one that we just looked at under W3 Schools and the other one that I mentioned to you, they have examples. But to sit there and just say flex, start, flex, and not show somebody what they look like, I mean, to me, was just kind of an exercise in futility. All right? They do show you this. I don't know. Does that help or does that not help? But you can start seeing how things are set up. I didn't even know there was this one. Didn't even mention it on ours. There's a space evenly. Never tried that one. I've done space between, space around, but I've never done a space evenly. Notice with that one, even the stuff on the ends is the exact same, what the remaining space. Width is everything else. All right. So as it says, the justify determines how they're aligned along the main axis. But again, the main axis can be horizontal, the main axis can be vertical. All right. All right, and that's what they talk about next, putting stuff on the cross axis. Now, some of these we've already talked about. This one, again, I want to mention this to you. Notice when you say align self, that's designed to grab one item that's in a Flexbox container and to allow you to, rather than treating all of them the same, you can just treat the ones separately. Now, you can do align self on more than one item in there. If you're doing an align self on everything, you might want to look at the way you've set it up because there's probably a better way to do it than the way you've done it. Some common values, and again, we've talked about stretch, center, flex start, and flex end. Okay? As it says, it determines how items are aligned along the cross axis for a container. Okay, the wrapping we also mentioned. In other words, what happens when you start to collapse the size of your screen window? Okay. By default, notice items are not wrapped. It's not going to wrap unless you tell it to. So as you really shrink the browser size down, it's going to look really bad. Okay, and if you haven't noticed this, I mean, when we first started, before we did any CSS, you can create a whole website with just HTML. You can. It'll look terrible and it won't act or react very well, but you can do that. All right. Then we added some CSS. Now we're refining the CSS that we're putting in here. We're trying to take control. All right. Allocating space, again, you saw this. The flex basis, so if you want to give something an initial value, the grow and the shrink, all right, and then flex, which is the shorthand. So you saw examples of all of these, and they show them in here as well. Like I said, I just wasn't overly impressed with their graphics in here, to be honest with you. but there are plenty of examples. All right, and as they mentioned here, you use basis, grow, and shrink to determine initial lengths. Okay. Notice they don't specify traditional CSS units like pixels, etc. They specify a number that represents a proportion. It works with the available space that you give it. But it's the old joke, like you can't shove 10 pounds worth into a 5-pound bag. So if you've got something that's only 200 pixels wide and you say, hey, I want the starting length to be 800 pixels, that's not going to work. Again, we talked about, and you saw changing the order on these. All right. And you'll notice, okay, and I believe in the last homework that you were given, you were supposed to do something similar to this, something like that. All right. You should be able to go back and do the exercises and use Flex. You don't have to. That's not part of your assignment, but I'm just saying you could do that. So by default, the items within a Flex container are displayed in the order which they appear. That should make sense. You circumvent that with the order property. All right, so the rest of the chapter here, the last 9 or so pages, as it says, is a responsive web page that uses Flexbox. This is it. Now, we talked about this before, and you'll notice, so when you go from maybe a laptop to a phone, or maybe this is a tablet, notice how it changes. The top still looks the same. Here, they probably have used that slick nav thing. So they've cut down the menu. They decided to take the guest speakers and put them first, and then underneath it, put the article. You could change that too if you wanted to, and make it the other way. All right? Again, I'm not going to sit there and read that to you. All the stuff that we have talked about still comes into play. You still use regular CSS. You still use media queries. But now we've got another thing in our arsenal, so to speak, that we can use. All right? So again, they go through and they give you the HTML for this. You don't have to type in a bit of this because you were given that stuff in your all web dev coursework. All right? You can take that and take a look at that if you're still confused as you're going through this. So here's the CSS. Notice display flex, flex basis, justify content. Go in here, bring this one up. Change this around. Change that to center. Change that to space between or space evenly. And see what happens. It says all float and cleared properties have been deleted. That's the big thing. Floats pretty much have gone bye-bye. But the reason that we still went over them is there are literally millions of pages still out there that were created over the years that people aren't going to change. All right? It's the old, is it broke? No. Then leave it alone. Yeah, but no. Don't tell me you'll make it better. It doesn't matter. If it works, leave it alone. All right? And you still could very well come across things that are like that. So here's the CSS on the end for mobile layouts. So you see how that changes. In fact, it's not at all uncommon that you could sit and have 2 different CSS files, your own CSS files. One that would handle mobile and one that would handle non-mobile. Or you might put a bunch of media queries in, which is, again, still more common, where you have just one CSS file, and by default, I may or may not have mentioned this, I may or may not have done it this way, but by default, most people put their media queries at the bottom of their CSS file, and they either, I think we did talk about this in class, they either go from smallest to largest or largest to smallest, whichever you want. But there should be rhyme or reason. I mean, if you work at a company of any size, there's at least a chance that you're going to have other people working with you. And if you just kind of throw stuff out all over the place, then that's the kind of reputation that you're going to get. That's not a good one to have, really. And that's it. So before we stop here, a couple more things that I want to mention to you. All right, so you've got this already. That's the Flexbox tutorial that's on here. You've got this, that how Flexbox work, that, you know, and you got the article sent. This is the reference that the article has. This is that Flex defense. This is that game, if you want to do that. The URL for it is in the article that I gave you. You don't have to write it down. All right. This is the Flexbox Froggy. This is another thing that's referenced in that article. It's called Flexi Boxes. I thought this one was much easier to read and understand than this one was. So I found my own. But they basically both do the same thing, where you can go in here and you can make changes and you can see the results right away. They also mention in that article a thing called Flexbox Patterns, where they show you how to set up different patterns. Now, I was going to give you this one originally, the Complete CSS Flexbox Tutorial by JavaScript Teacher. And he's got one for Flexbox and he's got one for Grid. But you look at it and he said, well, I decided I would draw this for you to make it easy for you to understand what's going on. And I looked at it and I got confused as to what was going on. All right? But again, there are hundreds of articles out there for this stuff. I found this, and I sent this to you too. Learn CSS Flexbox in this free and interactive tutorial. There's like 12 lessons in here, and they're anywhere from 5 minutes to maybe 10 or 11 minutes long. All right. Then finally, and I like some of this stuff. You've got the links to this. This is a guy named Colt Steele, and this is from his. Basically, he charges people. He's got a thing called Colt's Code Camp. And he grabbed part of it, about an hour's worth, and he put this out here. This is really well done. I've watched this a couple times myself. Now you say, well, I don't have an hour. Then don't watch it. All right? But I will tell you, this is something that as a web developer, you will be using this. There's another guy. In fact, let me show you him here. Let's see if they have his picture here.
This is Webflow Interactions, the only tool that brings all the animation power of CSS and JavaScript.
It's a guy named Kyle, and he's a little bit different, but he's got a thing on using Flexbox, and this is Brad Traversy. You've got all those links. You don't have to use any of them, all right? But you can take a look at them and see, you know, what you think of them. Now again, I'm waiting to hear back from Evan rather, and as soon as I do, I'll know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing next as far as your homework. But where is it? I do have the homework, and I want to show it to you. You haven't been sent this yet, but you have been. I have the homework for chapters. Let's see. This will be the homework for chapter 9. One of these you're probably not going to like, but there it says complete all 24 levels of that game. All right, that's if you use the Flexbox Froggy, or I think there's 12 levels or 16 levels in that Flexbox defense. When you're done, it should give you a screenshot saying that you've successfully completed. Hit your print screen, save that as a PNG file or a GIF file or a JPEG or whatever it saves as, and then just give me that. All right, to show that you've gone through it. And then create a web page with a nav bar that utilizes Flexbox. All right, I'll let you read the rest of it yourselves. All right. Then for your lab for this one, for chapter 9, all right. It says, code along with Mr. G's Flex Shop project. Well, Mr. G is Evan Gudmisted. He taped some of his lectures too. And he's got a series that he did on Flexbox. I think it's pretty good. I didn't go through all of it, but I went through a bunch of it. So it's going to be a lot. Any of you who have watched my tapes, it'll look kind of the same. Okay.
Okay, so what we're going to build today, everyone, is a website using Flexbox.
So you build an entire website doing that. All right. So what I'm planning on doing, again, unless I hear otherwise from Evan, is what I'm planning on doing is I'm giving you the rest of the period today for lab. All right. I'm not sure what we're doing yet tomorrow. I want to hear from him first. We're still going to have, at a minimum, Friday will be lab. All right, and the test probably next Monday will be lab, and the test will probably be Tuesday. I want to see, because I want to see exactly where his class is, etc. We're supposed to keep as lockstep as we possibly can. We're giving the same homework. We're supposed to be doing the same thing in class every day. All right, so as soon as I find that out, I will let you know. But in just a minute, or as soon as I hear back from him, if he says, well, I'm not assigning the Chapter 10 stuff, for which is on CSS Grid, then I won't assign it to you. If he says, oh, I'm assigning that, then I'll send you 9 and 10. The Chapter 9 stuff, the Flexbox, I'll give you today. It won't be due till a week from Friday. I think that's the 25th. All right. Most of you have been pretty good so far. Some people have not turned in their written test yet for chapters 5 and 6, if you haven't. All right, right now it's an X in the book, which means you haven't turned it in. By the end of the week, if it's not turned in, it's going to become a 0. All right. Questions on anything that I have gone over with you? Again, with some of this stuff, it's not going to make a boatload of sense until you start working on it. All right. Okay, if there are no other questions, the rest of the period is yours.